Hello, everybody. My name is Su Lianling. It's a great honor for me to be here today to present elaboration likelihood theory. My presentation will be 5 parts. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of the history and definition of the theory. Then I'm going to talk to you about the elaboration likelihood model, followed by the disciplines that utilize the theory and examples. I'm going to show critiques of the theory. Finally, I will discuss applications of the theory in agriculture communications. Elaboration likelihood theory, also known as ELM, was developed by Richard Petty and John Capsey-Opel in the mid-1970s. They summarized many empirical studies testing its various propositions. This theory incorporates some aspects of cognitive response theory, but goes considerably beyond it. They argue that mass communication situations can be conceptualized as evoking one of two routes to attitude change: the central route and the peripheral route. The central route involves persuasion through what they called message elaboration, basically scrutinizing the content of the arguments and then changing one's attitude on the basis of the merits of the arguments. The peripheral route involves attitude change based on clues irrelevant to argue quality. So the model of persuasion is a dual process theory describing how attitudes form and change. This model provides a framework to examine the individual variables, need for cognition and issue involvement, and situational variables that may influence the persuasion process through either the central or peripheral route. Here, the elaboration means degree to which an individual cognitively processes issue and relevant arguments within a persuasive communication. Likelihood means the probability that an event will occur. Of course, here the event is elaboration. So, persuasion is any instance in which an active attempt is made to change a person's mind. I previously mentioned the two routes. Now let's talk about them further. The central route to persuasion is marked by high elaboration. Elaboration is defined as the factor that relates information in a persuasive message to knowledge already possessed in order to arrive at new ideas that were not already present in the advertisement or stored in previous knowledge. The ultimate goal of elaboration is to judge whether the position taken in the persuasive message has any merit. The thoughts and responses that a person has in response to a message are called cognitive responses. In generating cognitive responses, a person is able to analyze the merit of the position taken. In order to evaluate a message, a person must be motivated and able. If they have both the motivation and the ability, a person can carefully appraise the message merit. It's important to know that appraisal varies from person to person and situation to situation. Peripheral route to persuasion is defined by the reliance on simple clues and environmental characteristics of the message to make decisions and judgments. For example, in the peripheral route, people rely on clues such as source attractiveness, perceived credibility of the source, and message length. Here, If either motivation or ability is not available to a person, there is a heavy reliance on peripheral cues as opposed to a message's factual information, which needs to be carefully analyzed. Cialdini identifies 6 types of peripheral cues: reciprocation, consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. Reciprocation describes a feeling of obligation to have a message based on a previous experience. Consistency describes when one relies on thoughts and feelings they had in the past. Social proofing is very similar to peer pressure. Liking refers to the attractiveness or view that the message source is likable. Authority refers to when a source is viewed as an expert or authority figure that should be trusted and obeyed. And scarcity is when the message is perceived as only being presented to a short time and must be accepted quickly. So we learn about the 2 routes, but what determines whether a person will take the central or the peripheral route to persuasion? Let's put the routes together to see how motivation and ability to process messages influence the route selection. Motivation to attend to message have 2 points. They have an involvement and need for cognition. Involvement is the degree of perceived relevance and personal importance, like high or low involvement. Then need for cognition is personality trait, reflects the extent to which people engage in and enjoy affable thinking, also like high or low need for cognition. The ability to attend to messages also has 2 points. The first one is freedom from distraction. Distraction disrupt elaboration and concentration must be possible. The second one is sufficient prior knowledge, which means the receiver must be able to understand information to be able to elaborate on it. Next, we will briefly talk about disciplines that utilize the theory and some examples. Researchers have applied the theory to many fields, including advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, healthcare, politics, and so forth. I will elaborate about the 3 criticisms of the elaboration likelihood theory. The first one is the type of information. The type of information affects message persuasion, which is determined by the processing of central or peripheral routes. Message variables are only inferential when the central route is used, and information like source variables are only inferential when the peripheral route is used. In fact, the theory does not make statements about types of information being related to routes. Rather, the key to the theory is how any type of information will be used depending on central or peripheral routes, regardless of what that information is. The central route may permit source variables to influence preferences for certain language usage in the message, beautiful, or validate a related product like cosmetics, while the peripheral route may only lead individuals to associate the goodness of source variables with the message. Theoretically, all of these could occur simultaneously, thus the distinction between central and peripheral routes is not the type of information being processed, as those types can be applied to both routes, but rather how that information is processed and ultimately whether processing information in one way or the other will result in different attitudes. A second instance is that processing the central route solely involves thinking about the message content and not thoughts about the issue. So, issue-relevant thinking is still a part of central route, and it's necessary for one to think about the message content. Lastly, a third instance of misinterpretation is the disregard of the quantitative dimension presented by the theory and more focus on the qualitative dimension. This quantitative dimension of the peripheral route involves low elaboration persuasion that is quantitatively different from the central route that involves high elaboration. With this different, the theory also explains that low elaboration persuasion processes are qualitatively different as well. It is seen as incorrect if the theory focuses on a quantitative explanation over a qualitative one. However, one of the theory's key points is that elaboration can range from high to low, which is not incorrect, as data from experiments conducted by Patty 1997 as well as Patty and Wagner 1999 suggest that persuasion findings can be explained by a quantitative dimension without ever needing a qualitative one. Now, let's move the theory into agricultural communication applications. The elaboration likelihood model affects how the agriculture angle frames agriculture messages on attitudes and intent to publish. The effect persuasive communication influences media coverage of agricultural science. Researchers used this theory in persuasive communication, and the communication was achieved through the use of positively framed messages to discover what impact the message frame had on communicators' attitudes toward argument quality and likelihood to publish the information. Some studies pointed out the potential for agriculture communicators to utilize persuasive communication to influence attitudes toward argument quality, while the likelihood to publish information remains a complex decision-making process. Communicators can be proactive in making their messages more attractive to those who make the decision to include information in the media by paying attention to how messages are framed. One example is risk communication. The theory was adapted to investigate the potential impact of hazard type, information source, and persuasive content of information on individual engagement in elaborative or thoughtful cognitions about risk messages. One study mentioned in the literature that consumers are facing food quality and safety uncertainty in today's agricultural food environment. It is acknowledged that food-related decisions and risk perceptions follow peripheral routes of information process. Nutrition awareness, communication that has been taught in schools and communicated by the nutrient center can flow via the central route of the theory. There was a high tendency to think about the topic thoroughly. The other way of information processing goes along the peripheral route, which involves clues such as information source of the message, form of the message, and the behavior of others. For ag ecosystem management, persuasive communication strategies also are used on shifting rural resident attitudes. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Contact me through email and I will be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your attention.